Our subscribers get it, with exclusive access to breaking news, briefs, reactions, opinion, and process. iPolitics. Are you up for it?
I'm Christopher Waddell of the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University, and we're back at Carleton for the second part of our iPolitics panel talk today. And now we're going to turn our attention away from the general issue of the public and what they think about politics and politicians and political parties, and focus more directly on the political parties themselves. At the end of this week, the Conservatives are meeting in Calgary. This was a convention that was supposed to be at the end of June, but then was postponed because of the flooding in Calgary. But the Conservatives had thought they were going to have a good time leading up to the convention of the speech from the throne, followed by the Canada-European Union trade agreement, But instead, there's been a pretty busy week with the Senate and everything else. So heading towards the convention at the end of the week, Jennifer Robson, what type of people go to political conventions, and what can people expect to see at political conventions for those who want to sit home and watch them this weekend?
Yeah. So the people who go to the conventions are kind of a subset of the voters. They're the ones who are like the core of the party. They're the ones who have the memberships, and they do the regular donations, and they show up to canvass, and they're the volunteers. They're more heavily involved, right? They're not the voters that the party relies on through these kind of transactional arrangements. I'll give you this, you vote for me this time. So the ones who go there they're the diehard supporters, but they're also the ones that you look at any convention floor, and the demographics are kind of stark, right? It's kind of the 50 and over set, and then the sort of, maybe 15 to 20 somethings, that the people who frankly have the time, right, to be able to give up to go to the conventions, and then a few of the professionals. Looking ahead to this convention in Calgary for the Conservatives, I don't think there's going to be any major fireworks that we're going to see. These things are heavily choreographed and meant to be, frankly, a little dull to watch from the outside.
Frank, can conventions be ways to get people engaged and get them back interested in politics, or are they even designed for that these days?
Well, yeah, they can occasionally, but for the most part, I think they're relatively anodyne and scripted affairs that don't really, particularly take example of the last convention for the election of the Liberal leader. I mean, by that point, was anybody really paying that much attention? There'd been an ad nauseum number of mini conventions and so forth. And I'm not saying that this didn't make the case of presenting the various leaders, but it was not the traditional notion of this giant sort of pyrotechnic convention where everybody shows up and everybody's riveted to television. It didn't work like that. So those things might be changing. But I do think that there's also changes going on in the way the folks that show up at conventions behave and their sort of reflection of the constituencies that they represent. And yeah, the question is sort of, do they have common characteristics? Obviously, they're heavily sort of politically oriented, activist types, so that's tautological. But beyond that, there's a decline in the incidence of people who belong to political parties in Canada. I think it's below 10% now. Other times in history,
I was going to say, at one point, if you were interested in an issue in your community and you wanted to do something about it, one of the ways you did something about it was join a political party and work for your candidate and get him or her elected to whatever it was, and then use that to try to build a constituency. That doesn't seem to happen much anymore.
Absolutely. And frankly, if you're to pick one ingredient of this plummeting of trust in government, it's probably the political party. The public now see political parties as analogous to trade unions that represent politicians and their friends, but not the broker. They don't broker the public interest anymore in the public's mind. And the public are generally wise on many things. I think there's a good degree of truth to that. There is another thing that's happened, I think, and by the way, Canada and the United States are quite different in this respect. In the United States, think about it, the party system there, which is really basically two parties, produces enormous levels of loyalty and inertia. So in the last election, of those who voted Republican or Democrat, 91% voted the same way the time before. Canadians historically are far more politically promiscuous. We have a broader number of samplings, and we will pick between those, and we'll move around.
Well, some parts of the country more so than
that's
others.
And that's one thing that's changed. We now find that the current government's incumbent government's base is tenaciously loyal. Not that many of them left, but they are absolutely rock solid committed. So that's different, whereas the rest are churning about and trying different choices. But another thing we found that I think that's new about political parties and who they attract, from a lot of the neuroscience, and I sometimes get glazed over when people mention, but some of it's actually quite relevant. we find now that there are distinct cognitive differences between the folks who are attracted to, say, the left side of the spectrum and the right side of the spectrum. And this is something which I think is an important insight, that there are fundamental differences in epistemology, worldview, the relative role of evidence versus emotion, moral certainty. And this is something I think which is an interesting new insight, which has been understood by political parties in the pursuit of how do we produce emotional resonance, and that is linked to understanding. So people say, for example, we should use attack ads. Those work really well. Well, it turns out that they work very well with people from the right side of the spectrum, some of this evidence show, because they're attracted and focus on those issues. But on the other side, no, they're kind of, want to see babies and kittens and all those kinds of things. So when we say, we should take a playbook from those guys and try to find why it didn't work. Anyway, I do think this new sort of dimension of understanding political partisanship and how it's not just related to activists who tend to say, this is a better choice this time, but there are hardwired kind of differences about how to see the world.
And does that change the nature of the parties themselves?
Probably does.
And who might be interested in being in a party these days? Because I think the point Frank makes is in part a good one, in that there aren't as many people in political parties, and I don't think political parties are thought of by many people as a logical response for the way to do something, if you're addressing something.
I guess, I would also sort of broaden the discussion a little bit to say that, in addition to thinking that you would change your community or your world by joining a political party, you also used to, join, community organizations and go to church. And we're doing less of all of that sort of stuff. So this disengagement we're seeing in a lot of different, ways. In terms of the political parties, if you end up in a situation where essentially you've got an increasingly homogenous group of people who think alike, who focus on the same kinds of things, who have even time perspective is important, it turns out. So if you're more focused on the past, you're more likely to be a conservative. You're more focused on, hope and future, you're more likely to be left of the center. The more that you have these people who are essentially just talking amongst themselves, the more the political parties become insular, and it gets harder and harder for them to expand.
And does our modern communication system make all that easier, so that it's in fact harder to get groups of people together who aren't talking alike and who aren't thinking alike? Because we can all communicate back and forth to each other and reinforce our prejudices or
that's just
our
it. Because we can choose and pick and choose, what we're going to read and who we're going to talk to and who we're going to follow on Twitter, and we're going to pick the ones that already confirm what we already think we know.
Frank,
that's extremely important, and the evidence is that rather than disrupting things, it tends to reinforce rather than alter views. In fact, I'm of the view that despite the fact that most people, even stronger amongst younger citizens, think that social media have had this liberating effect on democracy, I actually believe, frankly, it's been the opposite. Because what we find is that those people who are involved in, let's be rude, let's call it slacktivism or click democracy, actually, hey, I signed the petition or I went to the vote box, but I actually didn't vote. Right. And now I'm really embittered because I eloquently, in 130 characters, expressed my great disdain for this policy, and nothing happens. So nobody listens. Well, maybe you should go vote. On the political parties themselves, though, and who attends, I don't want to be overly cynical, but it's my perception that a lot of the folks that show up, I'm not going to call them props, but they're turning wheels attached to nothing. Frankly, the real decisions are made by such a narrow coterie of insiders that are designing things these days that I always felt dismayed when I looked at all the enthusiasm and genuine, authentic desire to make a difference on the party, on the floors of conventions, and the fact that I knew, basically, that you don't really have that much of a role to play. But I want to add in one final ingredient, which I think is linked to public disdain for the party system, is that, frankly, in addition to coming up with solutions for the public, which seems to be a diminished part of what they do, there's a system of tacit exchange or implicit favors that works back and forth for gaining power. That's why power isn't just there because, wow, I can bring my vision of a better world to fruition. It's also there because I exercise power. I can impose meaning. I can decide who wins and who loses and all the people around me. And that's a very potent elixir, and one which doesn't mix very well with the public sense that's tending to their interests.
So if you look ahead at the Conservative Convention coming up at the end of the week, there's been lots of talk and rumbling around. It hasn't been a particularly good few months for the government or for the Prime Minister. There's been lots of talk and rumbling around that the backbenchers weren't happy on certain issues. There are a few senators who aren't happy. There's a feeling among some people that some of the things that the government has got itself caught into in the last few months, in fact, are fundamentally opposite from what either the party rank and file believe in or what they thought they came there to actually do. So if you're a party member and you want to deliver a message at a convention to say, hey, guys and men and women, we better sharpen up here, do you have any hope of doing it at a convention, or can you do it at a convention, and how would you do it?
There are ways to do it. I think looking at what's kind of going to go to the floor at this convention coming up, less opportunities for them there.
And probably less when you're government than when you're opposition, maybe.
Sure, and because everybody agrees, we all got to make nice, and we all got to put on a good, united show. I mean, I've taken a look through the resolutions the policy resolutions that are going to get voted, and some of the constitutional resolutions that are going to get voted. So there aren't any kind of big, sexy leadership races or elections for party president or things like that are going to be happening.
Nobody's saying bring back the GST.
No, nothing like that. I mean, there are some signs of very small incremental nudges where the party membership are going to try and push the government just a tiny bit more to the right of center than maybe they feel that this government has been for a while. There's some minor incremental things that are going to be changing with the Constitution, but really, I think there's been an agreement that we're all just going to get along this for these couple of days, guys. No serious business raised publicly in front of the cameras. I think where the interesting things that are going to be taking place are in the hospitality suites, in the hallways, in all of those small conversations that don't necessarily get picked up and don't become visible. So
from a political party point of view, if you're using a convention to try to give yourself, for the Conservatives at least, this was supposed to be a period of time where they came up with a throne speech that was going to chart the mandate for the rest, or chart the course for the rest of the mandate, and that would be reinforced by the convention. Can they still use a convention for something like that, Frank? Or does
I think so. I mean, they will, for good reasons, try and get focus back on, what were somewhat, hard to stitch together. What was the thematic that held it all together? But it was
from the throne speech, you mean?
Yeah, from the throne speech. But it was certainly, a kind of appealing set of individual things to put in the store window under the tree for Canadians, and I'm sure a lot of them are appealing. So they'll want to get away from the nonstop debate about, Mr. Duffy and Senate spending scandals to trying to represent, here's the positive things we can do to make you have a freer choice of cable channels or not let those bad telcos hose you anymore. I do think, though, that there's one thing that's happening out there in the public that's really, really quite important. That is, we do see being responded to in sort of American politics, and less so in Canada. But as we see, as people are starting to look forward and even look backwards, are saying for the first time, we're not doing as well as we were in the last generation. That's sort of unprecedented. And when people say, how are our kids going to do? They're going, oh, that turns from gray to black. And they're really looking, I think, and we see in some of the long-term tracking, that they see as one of the solutions is this. Maybe we don't want big government, but maybe a more active government that's got some role to play in giving us some sort of blueprint for how we can secure a better economic future for our kids and even for ourselves a little down the road. There's really a lot of emphasis. I believe that a lot of the current government's problems, and I can track this, aren't really driven so much by the issues of the day as by what's been a slow decline over the last 6 or 7 years of a sense that the future economy is going to be better. And the further people look in the future, the darker they get. So I think they're looking for some answers about, how do we actually disrupt this? How do we get this evergreen theme of an inclusive, expanding middle class? It's really, I think this is issue one for the public.
And sorry, Jennifer, you're going to say something?
I was just going to say, I think Harper's already decided how he's going to answer that. Mm-hmm. And his theme is going to be, we can't take the risk of a change in government right now. It's a scary world out there. Acknowledge that we all feel a certain amount of anxiety in terms of, the hope for our next generations and the future of our economy. Your eggs are safer in my basket than putting them with, the risky NDP or the Liberals. And I expect him, to relay that message again at the convention.
Yet on some grounds, you look at the evidence, the economy's not doing as well as some people had hoped. Bank of Canada this week just came down and announced that they don't think interest rates are going to need to be raised for a couple of years. Our exports are not doing as well as we want them to. There are some signs there, but politics is all about people being able to exploit advantages, and so far no one has been able to exploit that, if that's an advantage, to come up with an alternate perception of what could be economic policy or what could be an economic strategy.
Possibly. I think that if we were trying to understand Justin Trudeau's improbable rise from 17 points to 36, 37 points in Analys's latest poll, that's a dramatic change. It wasn't a convention blip, it was a steady march. I think he's been talking about some of this theme, and the public are listening. I'm not saying that he's come up with a prescription. Frankly, he hasn't. Yeah. But at least he's saying, there is a problem here, because even if people feel okay about the short term, and labor market anxieties are actually lower than they were in the 90s, early part of the 2000s, but what's happening is this sort of despair about the medium and longer term future is increasingly infecting people's outlook. So they go, yeah, thank God we're not Greece or even Spain, but there's a sense that we're kind of in this slow period of decline. And when we ask people, like, are your kids going to be doing better, we find only 14% say yes. That's an awful statistic. And so I think even though, and I think the interesting thing is this incumbent premium, which is very powerful. We saw in the case of Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia, tired, reeling incumbents with 20-point disadvantages in the polls either wipe those out and almost win in the case of Quebec, or wipe them out and win. Mm-hmm. In each case, it was a product of turnout where the individuals, and some shifts, but not late minute, gradual shifts where people say, I'm not going to rock the boat. This is too fragile an economy to risk the adventure of a new leader, even if I am mad as hell. It may be different at the federal level, because I think this narrative of, well, it's not just, people don't hold their provincial government accountable for the economy 20 years from now, but they do sort of hold the federal government accountable for some longer term view of how to create a better future. And that's where I think there is an exposed flank. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. Mr. Harper and his government will say, well, look, we're doing relatively pretty well. Mm-hmm. My sense is when you look at the indicators on the direction of the country and some of these other more fundamental measures, that this is actually a deeper problem than the problems with Senate spending. But
the government response appears to be, from the throne speeches, you can deflect or defer that with a series of specific measures that we address to, which plays back to your original comments about the changing nature of how you're trying to build coalitions and do things like that. And that has proven successful with everything the government's done up to date in terms of the small tax measures they've done.
It was a really weird throne speech, honestly, like when you compare it to even previous ones that this government has done. And not just in terms of, it had the same kind of characteristics of having these sort of little things that they can put in the window. But there were just a couple of things in there in terms of factual kinds of alignment and whatnot. It was much longer. There was a couple of, kicks at the bureaucracy that I thought, there's something odd about this one.
But may play to their constituency.
It might. And that's exactly what I think
we may see
about.
Some of that at the convention, too. Exactly. I'm sure some of those things will be played out at the convention.
But we have to keep in mind now that their constituency, depending on which poll you believe, has been reduced from 39.6% to as low as 26%, and that's before the last sort of spectacle circus that we've all enjoyed.
But then coming back to your point about BC, Nova Scotia, and everywhere else,
that's right.
When it gets to the point of there actually being an election, things may be totally different.
But I think there is, and I'm absolutely mindful of that. And the other thing is this unique political arithmetic where you have a united party on one side with a fragmentation of the other options across four choices. It's a really inauspicious setup for those on the other side. But nonetheless, we do see, I've never seen the government struggling as much in terms of fundamental sense that we are keeping the country moving in the right direction. Even if you don't agree with, our specific management style or our decision on this or that, these numbers are unprecedented, and my view, these numbers do have predictive power. I'm not saying I have no idea how the next election will work out, and if I was a betting man, I wouldn't bet against them. But I'm saying there is something qualitatively different about their position and connection with the public and the country today compared to where they've been since they took office.
But is that partly a function, I wonder, Frank and Jennifer as well, of the fact that this is a government that pretty avowedly doesn't want to have plans? It's not a government. It's a government that believes the best government is a government that doesn't try to do a lot of things that are in people's face, or we're not going to have a national energy plan because we're not going to have a this or anything else. So does that change the whole dynamic?
It's not that they don't have a plan. They don't have a big visible plan to do a lot of stuff, but they have a plan to do less. So smaller government, more tax cuts, which reduces the revenue of the government.
Which is something we'll hear about at the convention probably this weekend, too.
Absolutely. I want to throw in one last long-term trend. We've been tracking values in Canada and the United States now for longer than I'd like to admit. But one thing we have found is that in Canada and the United States, even though everybody says, oh, please, I don't want more taxes, or I don't like big government, when you ask the questions the same way in a semantically consistent fashion through time, or when you measure values about statism, which has always been something which distinguishes Canadians and Americans, the trend lines are showing that people now are more receptive to the idea that we need government to do a little bit more in our lives, I'll exclude young people, than they were, say, 10 years ago. And it's been a pretty statistically and substantively significant rise. So I think the bumper sticker simplicity of the narrative, lower taxes, less government equals prosperity for all, in the public's mind in both Canada and the United States has been laid bare as a cruel hoax. They go, that may not be the only factor, but you know what? That didn't work. It worked well for you. You're doing very well, but frankly, I've been stuck or I'm falling backwards, and so are all my friends. So this is a bit of a collective epiphany. Doesn't mean that people are looking for, big bloated government, but it does set the table for a greater level of conditional receptivity. The government actually has to be part of the solution. And I think as well, people look around, they look at who are those other competitors out there on the global stage who are doing better than us. And they may frankly be noticing that governments are playing a much more active role in shaping. They actually have things like national industrial policies in places like Denmark, I dare say China, Singapore, India. And so there may be a sense that, and we do see it in the public for sure, that the answer that the night watchman states the way to go is losing traction with the public who say, we've tried that, it didn't work.
But not galvanized around any specific issues that government should be doing more here, or should be doing more there, or doing...
Maybe we're starting to get there in terms of issues around household financial security and income inequality and some of those issues. I don't know.
Yeah, income inequality is a very interesting one. And income inequality, for the first time since I've ever polled, and I've seen this in the United States as well, has become a pinnacle issue. But it's not the income inequality of the past. This isn't, it's really bad, this gap between rich and poor. That always was mildly troubling to Canadians, but it was never a pinnacle issue. What's vaulted us to a pinnacle issue in both Canada and the United States is a sense of not the gap between rich and poor, but the gap between that uber rich and all the rest of us poor schmoes. And that has really energized the public say, you know what, it's okay that if we're going to have like a period of protracted stagnation, where tepid growth, and we've seen that going on for 15 years to the extent we've never seen before.
Not so much up until about the crash, I would say, in Canada. If
you were to summarize a lot, you can argue with the statistics, but the last 14 years in upper North America have been the weakest growth of the last 100, since the last depression. It's basically averaged around 2 points over that period, whereas the rest of the time it was averaging more like 4 or 5 points. But the sense is that that's not going to change, and people attribute that in part to things like, well, those policies didn't work. But whatever meager profit and productivity is occurring, it's not going to me. It seems to be going to those guys that are driving around their jets like minibuses. And, this is now, some of the statistics are incredible. Like, Canada's moving more in that direction, not quite there, but I believe one of the most startling statistics in the United States, the wealthiest 400 people now have the same amount of wealth and income and wealth as the bottom 140 million.
Right.
Now think about it. This, by the way, if you measure things in terms of conventional measures like Gini coefficients or Lorenz curves, is a phenomenon which is going on in most of our major trading partners, but it's accelerating more rapidly, and Canada's actually going a little more quickly in that direction. The other thing which is going on along with that is the old notion that, okay, we have more inequality, but that's the devil's trade-off, that economic efficiency occurs and more people will get ahead, the American dream's going to work. No, we're finding the opposite. We're on a kind of what one of my colleagues calls a reverse Gatsby curve, and the places which have the highest levels of inequality are actually having the lowest levels of intergenerational mobility, to the point where if you look at the stats, you want to live the American dream, go to Denmark. And so this is now, people I think are sensing that if the incentive systems aren't broke and people feel they're not moving forward, then why try and climb a ladder with no middle rungs? And I think that's the issue which is troubling a lot of people in Canada and the United States.
But it's an issue that unfortunately the opposition parties, at least in Canada, haven't yet come across a way of figuring out how to turn that into an effective series of policies that could challenge the government.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're going to talk about when we come back in just a moment for the third part of our panel talk today.